Greetings. Greetings and welcome to you all to this 19th annual J.L. Dube Memorial Lecture of 2022. It is a great joy to have you with us. Thank you for joining this lecture. We are so excited as the University of KwaZulu-Natal to be hosting this annual lecture. Greetings to all of you, and may I start by acknowledging in our midst our DVC and principal of the College of Humanities, Usolwazi Unhlanhla Mkhize, Ubaba Ukhabazela Kamavovo. I also want to acknowledge the deans who are in our midst. We've got our Dean, Thabo Msibi from Education, our Dean, Usisi, Uhlongwa, Phakathi Kwethu. All of the people who are here, our deans and other colleagues that I would want to mention, and also to mention our co-chair of the lecture, Professor Mulesane, who is in our midst also. And I've already said that I'm also the co-chair, and my name is Professor Simangaliso Khumalo, the acting dean in the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics. I also want to welcome our speakers who are here. They will be introduced in a minute. The Dube family, who are expected to be here, may be joining us any minute, and going to be with us. We also have guests from different institutions. We've got guests from University of Salamanca in Spain, where our colleague Kumbulani Mkhize Ngadi is at the moment. And we also have people from the University of the Western Cape who have joined us, people from the Trinity College who are here, people from Ross University, and from the University of the Northwest. We welcome all of you, students, colleagues, activists, compatriots, to this, our lecture. This year, we'll be celebrating 151 years since the birth of John Langalbalele Dube. And so we are excited to be hosting this lecture, just to acknowledge the work that he did and the significant role that he played to the liberation of our society. Now, my job is very easy and simple. It's just to direct the program. And I will do my best not to be intervening and disrupting the program. Would like to see it move through smoothly without any interruption. Now we are going to start with having our DVC, Professor Mkhize, welcoming us and everyone who is here. After him, straight after that, Professor Thabo Msibi is going to come forward as it is written in the program, that he will be giving the strategic place of indigenous languages in an Africanizing University of KwaZulu-Natal. After him, we will have an interlude. And after him, after Ongezwa Mpele, who is going to be giving us the poetry, we'll have an overview of the J.L. Dube lecture series by Professor Mulesane. And then after that, it will move straight to Professor Masondo, who is going to introduce our guest speakers. And after that, they will go ahead and start speaking. I will only come back after Professor Nokhanyo Mtsanga has already spoken to then give a way forward. So I would like us to just go ahead and smoothly with the way that the program is structured. We'll start by having our DVC, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, to come forward and welcome you, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Humanities. Who else is better placed to do this welcome other than the leader of the college, who has also been there from the beginning of these lectures? Over to you, Kabazela. You can welcome us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Professor Khumalo. Mbulazi wenwa nqaba ukudla umlenze kwaBulawayo ubuza ukuthi owankhumuni ayisekho yini inkomo zakini engome wenwa welizambizi ngesikhali ngiyazibongela. Members of Council, members of Senate, members of the Executive, deans, fellow academics, and members of the Professional Services Division, the family of Baba Mafuguzela Dube, Nina Bagasilwane Kanjila Kangothoma, Nina Bagamkawe, Nina Mboma Poloba, Siyabonga ukuthi nibe khona nathi namhlanje. Staff, students, and members of the community, our local and international guests, our keynote speakers and panelists, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. On behalf of the management of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, it is my honor to welcome you to yet another edition of the John Langalibalele Dube Annual Lecture. In the year 2022, Dr. John Dube's contributions to the total emancipation of the oppressed peoples of our country are well known. Today's lecture will focus on Dr. Dube's contributions to African languages, isiZulu in particular. This focus coincides with the vision and mission of our university, which is to be a premier university of African scholarship. Like Dube, the university is playing a leading role in the efforts to intellectualize African languages, having approved its language policy in 2006 and revising it in 2014. It will be remembered as well that in South Africa, the language question in education was one of the issues that led to the student uprising of 1976. It is the uprising that served as a catalyst for a series of events culminating in the democratic political dispensation in the early 1990s. Like her sister African states in the aftermath of formal independence, South Africa has had to deal with the question of language, particularly the language to be used in the courts of law, in educational institutions, and the public sphere in general. During the apartheid era, the situation was very simple. English had already established its hegemony by virtue of being associated with the colonial enterprise. On the other hand, Afrikaans nationalists actively promoted the use of Afrikaans as a second national language, using massive state resources to achieve their objectives. Black languages remained the languages of the Bantustans and never achieved national prominence beyond those borders by and large. Paradoxically, and by default, it is during this period that the literary production and growth in African languages occurred and flourished. This growth has been checkered in the independence era due to the middle classes' preference for European languages among the African community, in my view. Education is central to the social, economic, spiritual, and mental and other forms of emancipation. For this reason, it is important to return briefly to Mafuguzela's role in pioneering the use of African languages. Language is not really a medium for communicating information simply from one source to another. In fact, it is the very process by means of which higher mental forms such as thinking, memory, emotion, etc. are formed. Research has shown that in South Africa, close to 50% of the learners that enroll for grade 1 drop out before they reach grade 12. Of the survivors, even fewer obtain a bachelor's pass, Of these, only about 4 to 5 pass mathematics and the sciences. Opening the doors of learning, therefore, requires us to use African indigenous languages alongside English as medium of teaching and learning. With this background, ladies and gentlemen, welcome you again to the 2022 annual lecture of John Langalibalele Dube. I pray and hope that you will enjoy today's deliberations. I thank you.
Londlo, we're waiting for Professor Msibi to come in.
Program directors, Professors Kumalo and Muletsane, the Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of the College, colleagues, or part of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. I'm absolutely delighted to be engaging you this afternoon, especially given the caliber of the panel that we have today. And of course, many of the individuals that are part of this panel happen to be dear friends of mine that I have so much respect for. So I'm very pleased, and thank you for the planning, to the planning committee for inviting such a distinguished panel. I have been asked by the planning team to speak briefly about the strategic place of indigenous languages within UKZN, but I thought maybe I should actually just speak about what we've been doing in the School of Education to advance the project of isiZulu or bilingual teaching. I want to, before I do that, briefly speak about my own experiences in relation to issues of language. When I arrived here at the University of Natal in 2002, I was very fortunate to be introduced to the works of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, particularly focused on the issue of language and identity. And this work was introduced to me by a very dear colleague who's now part of the Northwest with, I believe, Professor Kumalo, Langa Kumalo, Imanu Mgwashu, who was at the time focusing on the issue of academic literacy in English. Mgwashu introduced us at the time as a group of first-year students who were very impressionable, who came from very diverse backgrounds and who spoke very different languages. But he introduced this idea, which the Deputy Vice Chancellor has already mentioned, the idea that language does not just simply communicate, but it's also a carrier of culture in our day-to-day sort of linguistic practices. Prior to arriving at UKZN, I'd spent my entire high school experience at Escort High School, desperately trying to acquire the right accent and prowess in English that would place me at the same level as my other white peers who were speaking English very well at the time. Because they spoke English so well at the time, and they spoke English at home, and English was their mother tongue, they could understand the content at school, and they were placed in a very elevated status, and they were celebrated at school as actually being cleverer than Black students who were entering the formerly white schools at the time. Prior to joining Escort High School, I had been a township boy, a rural boy, who was very proud of my Zulu heritage and was very proud of my language. The valuing of English and by implication, British colonial culture, which is present at Escort High School, led me to a deep yearning to be white and to reject everything that was taught about my culture and also about my language. I started to view my language as somewhat primitive, somewhat backward, somewhat parochial. It was only through a deep awakening that I found here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and through deliberate efforts that I started to trouble the indoctrination that I had received at high school. Without the passionate academics who introduced me to counter-normative, at times decolonial ideas, I wouldn't have returned to a deep appreciation and understanding of who I am as a speaker of Zulu and also as a Zulu man. While I cannot ever deny that the advancement of English that was found at Escort High School played a profoundly important role in giving me the cultural capital to cope in South African universities and of course overseas, I often wonder about the millions who were excluded simply because they did not have the cultural capital nor the experience that I had acquired. As Ngugi argues, it is through language that culture is also transmitted. The strategic project of advancing indigenous languages in higher education institutions is a critical and an urgent one, not least following the calls from our students for a decolonized curriculum. Universities cannot afford to erase the identities of their students, thereby contributing to a linguistic genocide of indigenous languages. The advancement of indigenous languages in higher education institutions is in fact a social justice project. It is about enabling our students to disrupt popular received knowledge, with a view of enabling them to regain their human identity that has been denied through the schooling system that renders anything that falls outside white Eurocentric gaze as undesirable. Higher education institutions have a critical role to play in the project of knowledge production. It is also ever so urgent that for us to use our resources as higher education institutions to avert the death of our indigenous languages, and also to address the deliberate political and colonial project of marginalizing African languages. Here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, we recognize that one of the most critical ways in which we can build social cohesion, thereby healing our communities, is through the advancement of indigenous languages, particularly isiZulu, which is spoken by close to 80% of the population in the province. The School of Education recognizes its strategic positioning as an important site for the preparation of teachers who will teach the next generation of this country. This location gives us significant powers to influence the school system in more tangible ways insofar as the promotion of indigenous languages is concerned. It is for this reason that we are working with the Department of Higher Education and Training to establish a Center for African Languages Teaching, which will focus on the development of isiZulu language for the purpose of teaching and learning, while also enhancing the teaching of isiZulu at FET level. The school has also been forward-looking when it decided to offer a pathway for foundation phase majors to be offered in the language of isiZulu. While this pathway does not close off English mother tongue speakers to pursue foundation phase teaching, it does nevertheless ensure that the project of offering indigenous languages for the purposes of teaching and learning is advanced. Aligned with the institutional policies and strategies for the advancement of African languages across the curriculum, the school has been actively involved in supporting the bilingual tutorial language support that is offered through ULPDO, which coincidentally was actually launched by Professor Langa Khumalo, who is a panelist today. Our staff members offer training to other staff members across the university. The school also has been quite heavily involved again in a ULPDO project of translating abstract into isiZulu. The school has gone as far as also offering the B.Ed honors modules in languages and media studies specialization in both English and in isiZulu. This also includes undertaking research and writing research through the medium of isiZulu. Recently, we've embarked on an ambitious project to identify modules across the classes that can be offered bilingually through the medium of isiZulu and in English. We are also in the process of seeking to translate all the course outlines to the medium of isiZulu, and are also exploring possibilities of translating examination and test questions to the medium of isiZulu. In pursuing all of these strategic projects, we are highly cognizant that we are still simply scratching the surface. We appreciate fully the fact that translation alone cannot ensure understanding. Indeed, one may even run the risk of creating further confusion, as concepts and terminologies are, like in all languages, human constructs. They require repeated expression if they are to be shared or to find shared meaning. It is for this reason that while we embark on all of these efforts geared towards the advancement of indigenous languages, we need to be careful about the manner in which our efforts are perceived and received on the ground. And I think that DVC's introductory remarks about Afrikaans are clear and a clear indication of why it is so important, because it is not just that the language of Afrikaans was introduced that there was this reaction. It was also through the ways in which power and violence were used while advocating for Afrikaans. We do not want the same experience for African languages, particularly indigenous languages, nor should we, however, be naive to think that the advancement of indigenous languages will be warmly received or will be apolitical as we try and engage in this endeavor. UKZN has made serious strides in advancing indigenous languages, particularly the language of isiZulu. Our commitment to a decolonial, transformed society that espouses African values and pursues African excellence mandates that we become even more deliberate in our efforts and that we learn from others within the African continent and also beyond. It is, in fact, our ethical responsibility to do so. This afternoon's session is full of passionate, experienced panelists who no doubt will help us in advancing indigenous languages, in the same way that John Langalibalele Dube did when he launched the first indigenous isiZulu newspaper, Ilanga Lasenatal. I look forward to the deep learning and to a liberating experience this afternoon. Thank you.
It's Professor Muletsane. Itongezwa.
Sanbonani, Molweni, Dumelang, Absheng, Jambo, Muribanj, Ndape. Our languages in their greetings and gratitude carry the gentle reminders of our humanity. Sawubona in this Zulu is a greeting that means, I see you. Those who you walk with, who are alive and dead, I acknowledge you. If ever we should be blinded by the scorching injustices, remember the call to really see each other. Remember the call to really see each other. Sawubona, sanbonani. Zulu means heaven and weathers. Black people daring to call themselves Zulu is the magic of the imagination, to see oneself beyond what your oppressors sees in you. Sisaphila, siyaphila. We are answer to the call of being seen and seeing. We utter that today, in this hour, in this minute, that we are alive and we are breathing as the waves of violence attempt to strip us of our mother tongues and our ways of knowing that got us here as Black people. In our greetings, we meditate on being alive and surviving yet another day. Our languages are ways of thinking and being. They are an embodiment of our cacophonies and complexities. May we thrive and soar in knowing this. May we remember that this, as the English language, colonizes the landscape and the fullness of our mother tongues. May we hold this truth under our tongues as we are called purists, essentialists, for just basking in the sun rays of our ancestors' works and language strategies. They didn't write, they say, but we say they spoke life to us in languages and rituals that sailed across the oceans of enslavement. Or see me in this poem being distracted by voices that don't see our languages. Or see me in this poem being enslaved by arguing with voices who have made English language the only language of intelligence. Or see me being corrected on this Word document with red marks on the vernacular words of this poem. Digital spaces in their advancement and futuristic nature did not imagine the vocabs of the Bantu sitting on white papers. Oh, how I long for the day that I don't have to prove my worth to a languaging that has never pictured me speaking with the fullness and centrality of my lips and body. Hold my colonial woundedness. Let me not be distracted by its pus and smell. How do we teach the language of love, futures, and healing when our languages bleed with red lines on Word documents in the fourth industrial revolution? In Setswana, we heed the greetings call with the word pula. Let it pour with rain. Pula. Let it pour with rain. Pula. Let the waters nourish and quench your thirst in this fight of injustice. We are not divorced from nature. Ours is a marriage forged in our mother's womb. Pula is our currency to the water wars we find ourselves in today. Our greetings and carry prophecies of what has mattered to our souls through time. When we once questioned if we even had souls. In Sesotho, they say, kiteng, meaning I am here. Dumelang, kiteng, I am here. Whatever violent, evil force tried to remove me from this earth, it failed today. I wonder what your mother's tongue says when it disappears from your memory, your subconscious, your brain, your body, your smell, your eyes, your taste. Does it bellow with grief at all the ancestry work of ukulima, ulimu lwakho? When I heard for the first time that the word utata existed in the Bemba language, which is spoken in Zambia, I buried myself in the archives of oral storytelling. In fact, I'm still buried in the archives and waiting for the truths about who we really are in Africa to be resurrected. When my name, Ongezwa, existed in Swahili, in isiXhosa and Zulu with duality of meanings and varied meanings, I allowed myself to dance in this multiplicity of being. When siyathokoza is joy in isiZulu, and thank you in Chewa, a language spoken in Malawi. So with this poem, I'm putting bandages on our gushing wounds. With this poem, I am coming undone in these fractured languages. With this poem, I'm seeing the labor of those who are told, we are told didn't write, but spoke, and named their children with the dreams that they had for them. And they gave us clan names that mapped and archive our migration patterns across these colonial borders in Africa. Ngiyabonga.
Sanibonani, dumelang, kgotsong, molweni, madume, jambo. Good afternoon, goeienaand. As part of its research and community engagement project, among other things, UKZN and its various entities, as you have heard, focus on developing and disseminating knowledge through seminars and public lectures, like any other university. The annual John Langalibalele Dube Memorial Lecture is the College of Humanities' contribution to this project. Beginning in 2003, the lecture was hosted by the then School of Religion on the Pietermaritzburg campus. With the establishment of the John Langalibalele Dube Chair in Rural Education in 2010, which I currently hold, the School of Education and the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics have collaborated in organizing and alternating the hosting of the lecture on the Pietermaritzburg and the Edgewood campus. My colleagues and I are fortunate to have the support of the leadership of the DVC and head of college, Professor Mkize, and our two deans of our two schools, Professor Thabo Msibi and currently Professor Smangaliso Khumalo, acting. More importantly, though, over the years, we have had very strong support from the Dube family. We thank you again for that. just a glimpse into the history of the lectures since 2003. I promise I won't go back to 2003. Rather, I will focus on the last 3 years of COVID-19 to just illustrate how the lecture has responded to what universities and South Africa have been going through. So in 2019, the lecture was delivered by Dr. Bongani Ngulunga, and the title of the lecture was Lessons of Struggle, from the pioneering generation to the fallist movement, the fees must fall and so on. And then in 2020, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize delivered a lecture titled Locating the Umbilical Cord in Africa, Why the South African Decolonization Debate Must Resist North and Latin American Academic Trends. Then last year, in celebration of the 150 years of John Langalibalele Dube, we held a week-long series of webinars, which culminated in the main lecture on Thursday delivered by Prof. Sheriff Keita. So on Monday, Professor Nceba Qaleni delivered a lecture titled African Traditional Medicine and COVID-19 Vaccines. And then on Tuesday, Lukhona Mnguni and Mike Mwendani focused on land, climate change, and higher education. On Wednesday, Professor Heather Hughes and Dr. Deborah Mindri, with Miss Nana Jali, who's the granddaughter of Langalibalele Dube, focused on unsilencing Nokutela and Angeline Dube. On Thursday, as I said, Prof. Sheriff Keita delivered the main lecture celebrating 150 years of John Langalibalele Dube. Concerning the focus of today's lecture, I won't spend a lot of time on it, which is titled or themed the Indigenous Languages and Decoloniality in Higher Education, a conversation with J.L. Dube. I go back to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who has been mentioned several times already, in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, where he argues that the starting point for any decolonization project is language. While there is tons of scholarship and engagement with the notion of decolonization and decoloniality in the South African higher education system, the discourse is almost always devoid of any role of languages, particularly African languages, in the teaching and learning situation. What would John Langalibalele Dube say, for example, about the place of African language in the decolonization of the university curriculum? So today's lecture or the John Dube Memorial Lecture, a flagship of the Humanities at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, seeks to interrogate these questions. The panelists honoring us in this year's lecture include some of the key scholars whose work is concerned with language issues, particularly African language in the knowledge generation and teaching and learning. The panel discussion, we hope, will assist us in reflecting on the role of language, particularly in the context of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution on the one hand, and the decolonization debates on the other. So the organizing committee made up of myself, Sibusiso Masondo, Mangaliso Kumalo of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, Kumbulani Mgadi and Jabulo Manyoni of the University Language and Planning and Development Office, Poliswa Zulu from the Public Relations Office, and Konzo Mkhize from the School of Education invite you to sit back and enjoy tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Molweni. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. After deciding on the topic for this year's lecture, the committee went through a process of finding scholars with the passion, scholars who are practitioners, who would do justice to the topic, scholars who would bring life to this topic. We were looking for people who were not just scholars, but activists as well. In the three speakers, we found people who could speak to this topic with authority. Professor Nsibi has already said that this is a high caliber panel that we have. The first member of the panel is Dr. Thulani Mkhize. I was surprised when I first met Dr. Thulani Mkhize because I expected something different when I first met her. And when she explained herself, she said her name was given to her by a grandmother. And there was a history behind the name, which is very interesting. As African people, our names are not just given. They're given because of a reason. There's a serious reason behind the giving of a name. If you want to know that, you must get in touch with her. She will explain to her. She's also royalty for those who want to know. But the most important thing is that she's a senior lecturer in English studies, and her area of research is in Black South African writings in newspapers, contemporary African narratives, and decoloniality, and she calls it ukuzilanda. She's also an editor of the South African Journal of African Languages. So, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Dr. Thulani Mkhize. Our second speaker is Professor Langa Khumalo. Professor Khumalo was with us at UKZN for a number of years. He is currently a professor and executive director of the South African Center for Digital Language Resources at the Northwest University. He has done a lot of work, but I think the most relevant aspect of his work for what we are doing today is that he is the chairperson of the Community of Practice for the Teaching and Learning of African Languages. He's the chairperson of that group of people. So he is involved in that community. So that community is responsible for drafting or charting a way forward about how African languages would be taught in higher education. So that is important. And there are other things that he is involved in, but for our purpose, that is important. And he is also a member of the SADC Indigenous Knowledge System Scientific Community of Practice. Is an award-winning author in intelligent text processing and computational linguistics. He has been an invited speaker and keynote speaker at various local and international conferences and colloquia. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Langa Khumalo. And our last speaker is Professor Nokhanyo Zanga, who comes to us from Gqeberha. She's an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at Nelson Mandela University, a qualified teacher who has taught at high school. She too is a vice chairperson, works with Professor Khumalo in the Community of Practice for the Teaching and Learning of African Languages. When I asked earlier, when I asked the panel earlier whether there was anything embarrassing that I should know so that I can tell the general public, she said, I don't want to know. But the most important thing that the public needs to know is that she also is part of this group. So she is very passionate about the teaching of indigenous languages at tertiary institutions. So she comes with that experience. She has also worked and she has, in her recent book chapter, she argues that language as a social justice issue in post-colonial higher education institution is a very important issue that we need to take into cognizance. She is an external examiner for several higher education institutions, and she has supervised both master's and doctoral students. She has presented her work in both national and international conferences and peer reviews articles for several accredited journals. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Nokhanyo Mzanga. Here are our three panelists, and we will have Mr. Khumbulani Mungadi, who is going to respond to them. So the floor is yours. First, we'll have Dr. Thulani Mkhize, then we will have Professor Khumalo, followed by Professor Nokhanyo Mzanga, and then Professor Khumalo will come in to give the floor to Mr. Mungadi. Over to you, Dr. Mkhize.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Dube family and the organizer of the J.L. Dube Memorial Lecture for the privilege of entrusting us with this platform. As seen on the program, the title of my contribution is Vernacular Pasts and Their Present Power, the case of the 19th and early 20th century newspapers. I believe that the contribution will be made available to attendees in English and in isiZulu. The reason for focusing on newspapers from this period, particularly missionary newspapers, is not only because they were written in indigenous languages, with some translations and sections in English, but because they contain the first recorded discussions, debates, and intellectual contributions of the first generation of African intellectuals who were the first to receive literate education and were on the forefront of the colonial encounter. What we gain from this exercise of going back to this period is that we discover that such ideas as Black consciousness, decolonization, and decolonial discourse precede their famous proponents, such as Steve Biko, Frantz Fanon, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Secondly, we see that the issues we wrestle with today with regards to indigenous languages, education, African intellectual history, they too wrestled with. Thus, we have a heritage of struggle and victories to draw from. The reason that the contributions of early African writers have remained on the periphery is because they were published largely in newspapers rather than in book form, and they were in indigenous languages, in a climate that centered and viralized contributions in English. In his seminal work, Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o highlights the significance of the use and preservation of indigenous languages. He explains that cultural imperialism in Africa had wielded what he terms a cultural bomb, and he describes it as follows. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's beliefs in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them want to see their past as a wasteland of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that past. It makes them want to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves, for instance, with other people's languages rather than their own. As background, I am to demonstrate that the African intellectuals of the 1800s who were on the forefront of the colonial encounter had a slightly different experience than the one Ngugi describes. For an example, in 1823, John Benny from the Glasgow Missionary Society arrived in Dube village in Alice in the Eastern Cape with a printing press and embarked on learning isiXhosa and committing it into writing. isiXhosa thus became the first Bantu language to be reduced to writing, and the Xhosa the first to receive literate education and Christian evangelism. For greater reach and impact in their assignment, missionaries developed African languages so that the Bible and key texts could be translated into indigenous languages. It was during this time that newspapers were introduced by missionaries as vehicles for their educational and religious project. The newspapers published in indigenous languages with some sections in English, and this became the model for missionary newspapers throughout the country. This was obviously an exciting time for the development of indigenous languages. And in 1862, we read in the first issue of Indaba newspaper, the following call made by Reverend Tiosoga. Our veterans of the Xhosa and Imbo people must disgorge all they know. Everything must be imparted to the nation as a whole. Fables must be retold. What is history or legend must be recounted. Whatever was seen, heard, or done under the requirements of custom should be brought to light and placed on the national table to be sifted for preservation. Were there not several tribes before? Where is the record of their history and customs, good or bad? Had we no chiefs in days gone by? Where are the anecdotes of their periods? Were these things buried with them in their graves? Is there no one to unearth these things from the graves? Were there no national poets in the days of yore? Whose praises did they sing? We should bring to light all this great wealth of information. Let us resurrect our ancestral forebears who bequeathed to us a rich heritage. Soga, along with his contemporaries, saw this as a defining moment for indigenous languages and spurred the development of African languages, literature, and history. The significance of this is that unless this was done, and by Africans in particular, future generations would be ignorant of the intellectual labor and achievements of their predecessors, and would instead be amazed by the history, languages, and achievements of those who conquered them. Thus, newspapers become an important tool in the preservation of African languages and history. Decades later, this was reiterated by H.I.E. Dlomo, who describes this period as follows. It was a time when men suddenly became conscious of the wealth of their threatened old culture, the glories of their fathers, and the richness of their tradition, the beauty of their art and song. It is a time when lamentations and groans, thrills and rejoicings find expression in writing. It is a time when men discover in their history great heroes and heroines whose activities are near enough to be of interest and meaning, but remote enough to form subjects of great, dispassionately passionate creative literature. It is a time when men and women realize they can preserve and glorify the past, not by reverting back to it, but by immortalizing it in art. These early African intellectuals worked hard alongside missionaries to record their languages, history, literature, and song, which set into motion the accelerated development of indigenous languages. However, this euphoria was short-lived. With the spread of missionary education and what Ngqongqo argues, the increased racism of the second generation missionaries, the African elite also began to take their fate into their own hands. They began to be politically conscious and active. And this was partly due to increased censorship in missionary newspapers and book publishing, as well as clashes with colonial forces. We see this discontent with the traditional structure of missionary education in J.L. Dube's own life, when in 1894, he established his own mission, and soon after day school in the Mkomazi Valley, where learners were encouraged to read in isiZulu and to focus on practical aspects of the curriculum. In 1900, J.L. Dube established the Zulu Christian Industrial Institute, which was renamed the Ohlange Institute in 1901. The institute functioned as a school where African children obtained education. Rather than the continued excitement of the introduction of the printing press and its implications for indigenous languages, missionaries educated Africans began to face unprecedented challenges. And in 1882, writing 20 years after Soga's imploration, Isaac Wauchope Citashe, in his poem Zimkile Mfohlanga, loosely translated, "They are gone, my countrymen," urges the reader not to lose heart because of the physical battles faced, but to transition their efforts into an intellectual battle. The poem rouses the reader to action as follows, and I will read the original poem. Zimkile Mfohlanga, phuthuma phuthuma, yishiya imfakadolo, phuthuma ngosiba, thabathi iphepha ne-inki likhaka lakho elo. Ayamka amalungelo, qubula usiba, nxasha nxasha nge-inki, hlala esitulweni, ungangeni kwahoho, dubula ngosiba. Thambeka umhlathi ke, bambela esibunzi, zigqale inyaniso, umise ngomxholo, beka izitho ungalwi, umsindo liyilo. The English translation is, "Your cattle are gone, my countrymen. Go rescue them. Go rescue them. Leave the breech loader alone and turn to the pen. Take paper and ink, for that is your shield. So pick up your pen, load it with ink. Sit in your chair. Report not to Hoho, but fire with your pen." Citashe's poem shows the power and possibility of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. This is also illustrated in the works of Theo Soga, William Wellington Qoba, Isaac Wauchope, H.R. Idlomo, J.L. Dube, S.A.K. Mkhayi, Nontsizi Mgwetho, to name a few, who, although they were assimilated socially into Western culture, they meant to empower themselves so that their people could overcome adversity. This is also seen when Dube established the first indigenous Zulu newspaper, Ilanga Naselental, in 1903. His aim was for it to become a mouthpiece for the Black population and to expose injustices. Among the second generation of missionary educated Africans, there was increasing resistance to teaching and learning taking place in English. The famous Xhosa writer, historian, and teacher, S.C.K. Mkhayi, in the early 1900s, advocated for the teaching of agriculture in isiXhosa. When the principal refused him to do so, he humorously asked, "Will the cabbages not grow if I teach agriculture in isiXhosa?" This illustrates that from the onset, the education system was systematically designed to diminish the status of indigenous languages as languages of learning and teaching. In his foreword to S.C.K. Mkhayi's Isiganeko Zesizwe, Professor Bonnie Pityana explains how, as an African student, he viewed African languages during apartheid, when teaching operated through English and Afrikaans. He states, "The truth of the matter is that we were thoroughly colonized to see value in that which was both foreign, but also acclaimed to be the symbol of value and learning, and that which came with colonial ties. Secondly, though our urge to oppose apartheid in all its forms blinded many of us to exercising our independent minds to know what is good for us independently of colonial designs of the oppressive system. In a nutshell, that explains why it is after so many years, African languages are still not accessible and utilized as languages of science." Interestingly, in 1885, William Wellington Qoba wrote a poem in isiXhosa titled Ingxoxo enkulu ngemfundo, umzekeliso, translated A Great Debate on Education, a Parable, which was published in the bilingual newspaper Isigidi samaXhosa in 1885. The poem contains the first recorded resistance to colonial education in South Africa, and it illustrates that early African intellectuals were not passive recipients of Western ideology. They embraced Western education, but interrogated its contents and sought to use it for the benefit of African people and to resist colonial domination. The poem is in the form of a debate where two groups of students offer opposing views about the colonial missionary education they received. One group is happy and grateful for this education and wants to maintain the status quo, whilst the second group is depicted as disruptive and labeled as ungrateful because of its calls for decolonization of the curriculum. This particular group of students from the missionary classroom refused to be passive consumers rather than active participants in their own higher education. They had observed discrepancies between their lived experiences, and they were taught that what they were taught in the classroom, which is positioned as the only space of academic knowledge, thus excluding the communal nature of knowledge production. Sadly, this is as relevant today as it was in 1882. At the time, this debate, of course, fell on deaf ears because it went against the colonizing mission, just like the protests against the enforcement of teaching in Afrikaans in 1976. The fallist movements such as #RhodesMustFall have merely revived these old debates and highlighted the urgency of transforming institutions of learning and exploring what an African university, rather than a university in Africa, can and should be. As Heleta argues, one of the most destructive effects of colonialism was the subjugation of local knowledge and the promotion of the Western knowledge as the universal knowledge. European scholars have worked hard for centuries to erase the historical, intellectual, and cultural contributions of Africa and other parts of the non-Western world to our common humanity. The result of this is epistemic violence on people from outside the European scholarly axis. A pertinent example is Nelson Mandela, who in his biography, Long Walk to Freedom, describes his education at the University of Fort Hare. He writes, "For young Black South Africans like myself, it was Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale all rolled into one." This shows that the educational system at the time did not take into cognizance the contextual relevance of the curriculum, but was bent on reproducing a Euro-American education system in Africa. Yet, as our heritage of struggle shows, students desire meaningful engagement with their context. They do not just want to be regurgitators of knowledge, but to first link what they learn with their immediate context and with the option to do so in their mother tongue. Hence the need for knowledge to be inclusive and representative. The post-apartheid South African higher education landscape has changed dramatically, as evidenced by the increased student enrollments across all universities, and the number of African students in the entire higher education system has grown significantly, which has led to unprecedented linguistic and cultural diversity and its resultant challenges. The cultures and languages valorized within tertiary institutions inadvertently show the value assigned to certain language groups and cultures above others. Thus, it becomes clear to African students entering universities previously designed for white students that they're entering a space not made with them in mind, even well after democracy. Decolonizing our universities is about raising the status of African languages and African intellectual contributions to the same parity of esteem as English, in order to reflect the multilingual society that South Africa is. It is about epistemic diversity and opening up dialogue with other epistemic traditions and canons, without one exercising dominance and privilege over others. It is about learning and teaching taking place from an African context as a point of departure, and with African languages at the forefront in African universities. The longer this process is delayed, the more we delay Africa's contribution to global knowledge societies, which will continue to perpetuate the false idea that scientific knowledge only comes from the Euro-American center and that they have exclusive rights to its development. The first Black female novelist in Zimbabwe, Zizi Dagaremba, was once asked why she chose to be a writer. Her answer was, "Because I did not see myself in literature, and I wanted to see myself." We should see our histories, languages, intellectuals, and forebears reflected in our education, in our institutions, in our journals, in our literature, so that our successors don't have to wonder about Black intellectual contributions, without which we run the risk of thinking that we are the first to do the work already done by intellectual forebears, or worse, that we have no intellectuals of our own to draw from. On Dube's passing in 1946, Vilnkomo summed up his life when he wrote in Umthetheli Wabantu that Dube has revealed to the world at large that it is not quite true to say that the African is incompetent as far as achievement is concerned. In conclusion, going back to the work of early African intellectuals on the forefront of colonial encounter provides much needed historical clarity. Only with their contributions on the table of ideas, among other epistemic traditions and contributions, can we correctly appraise other intellectual contributions. In order for us to reach a state of notable and systemic decolonization, we need to address the erasure and exclusion of African knowledge makers and African languages as languages of scholarship. This requires going back to our own educational journeys, both in and out of the classroom, interrogating and critically appraising them, and using concepts familiar to us and in our own languages to theorize from and articulate our ideas. This is a strength-based approach, as it requires to draw from what is already available in our languages and intellectual traditions, and encapsulates a going back to recover that which was pushed to the margins and is key to the development and success of our institutions. Thank you.
I want to first recognize the J.L. Dube family. And I also want to recognize the program director, Professor Simangaliso Khumalo, the DVC of the College of Humanities, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, and the deans and head of schools that are here present, Professor Moletsane and the members of the organizing committee of the J.L. Dube lecture, fellow academics, student leaders that are here present, ladies and gentlemen. The title of my talk is African Languages in the Context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a Decolonization Perspective. It is such an honor for me to be back at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, albeit virtually, where I spent a decade as an academic in the linguistics program and as director of the Language Planning and Development Office. The relevance of the latter will be clear soon. It is indeed good to be in familiar company with old friends and acquaintances. It is even a greater honor to be invited in a panel to deliver the John Langa Libalele lecture. It is just over a century and a half, 151 years to be precise, since the birth of this literary giant and political icon. His work and ideas, however, still endure. My talk today is premised on two major initiatives of J.L. Dube's enduring work. The first is his vision to establish the Ohlange Institute, which he founded in 1900 after his sojourn in the United States of America, where he was influenced by Booker T. Washington's similar work. The second major initiative was the establishment of the Ilanga Lase-Natali newspaper in 1903, which is just shy of 120 years of existence. These two initiatives speaks to the central theme of my talk, that is language and its centrality in knowledge production, knowledge dissemination, and the translational impact of that. The Ohlange Institute, which is now known as Ohlange High School, and the Ilanga Lase-Natali newspaper, which is now known as Ilanga newspaper, are two institutions that embody the vision of a man who lived well ahead of his contemporaries. The former attests to J.L. Dube's vision to see education as vitally important in transforming the lives of Black people who are burdened by the colonial history of subjugation. The latter, a mission to use mother tongue, that is isiZulu, as a vehicle of understanding one's history, a vehicle to articulate one's complex challenges, and a powerful tool through which to shape in a novel way the future through a newspaper platform that still publishes in isiZulu up to today. Program director, Ubaba J.L. Dube knew then that language is an essential part of that which makes us human. It is at the heart of our human existence. The mother tongue is inextricably linked to our cultural identity. It formulates and records our personal and social experiences. The use of mother tongue in education stimulates and enables the child's literary skills. It enables the child's cognitive development. It stimulates the child's critical thinking and stimulates the child's imagination and innovation. And this is attested in the literature. Thus, the organization of knowledge and its transmission is facilitated through language. According to Kwesi Kwapra, education, and I quote, cultural empowerment and scientific and technological development in Africa will be more practically realizable if people's mother tongue or home language is given greater primacy in African educational and developmental approaches, end of quote. Education, which involves the training of citizens and intellectual growth, is conducted through language using various models and discourses. While the use of mother tongue in education in general and in higher education in particular is gaining traction in this country, it was proscribed altogether during colonialism and apartheid, with African languages limited to narrow use at home as village registers. African languages remain resource-scarce languages. This scarcity includes the paucity of exhaustive grammatical descriptions, the compilation of both large and specialized corpus resources, the development of machine-readable lexicons, and the development of human language technologies. The scarcity of these resources is a threat to the future of these languages. This is because the context of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, which I will explicate more in a moment, relies on digital data sets. The absence of these in African languages means that these languages are not part of the digital infrastructure, which may mean that their continued use into the future may be threatened. The vision of the iconic figures such as J.L. Dube and early writers of isiZulu meant that there is a body of literature that exists in African languages. In my earlier role at the UKZN in 2014, the university at the time took a strategic decision to build an isiZulu national corpus. In brief, a corpus is a carefully designed and systematically collected natural language data from a variety of text types and sources following a particular set of principles, which constitutes a sample or a data set that statistically reflects the use of that language and is stored and accessed by means of computers. The isiZulu National Corpus is built on the enduring work of J.L. Dube. The Ilanga newspaper forms a huge part of the collection of isiZulu writing over time that make up the isiZulu National Corpus. Ilanga newspaper alone accounts for the biggest number of files in the isiZulu National Corpus, with a total of 970 electronic files that make up 4.3 million tokens of a corpus that stands at 31.7 million tokens. Something that is hugely plausible in the context of African languages and their status and role. It is through such an important data repository that a critical computational technology, such as an isiZulu spelling checker, was built. The first version of isiZulu spelling checker was officially launched in October of 2016. The subsequent version was released in 2018. I want to argue, Program Director, that it is through the vision of our literary icon, Umafuguzela, as he is also affectionately known, that isiZulu is able to achieve such a milestone. It would not have been possible to create a spelling checker without the isiZulu National Corpus. It would not have been possible equally to have an isiZulu national corpus without the data sets that came as a result of the Ilanga newspaper in its electronic written form. I will quickly discuss the broad context of 4IR in order to show how the enduring work of J.L. Dube assists in amplifying the role of African languages, particularly isiZulu, in the academy. The fourth industrial revolution is a term that was coined by Klaus Schwab in 2015. It defines a world that is characterized by both the rapid rate of automation and interconnectedness. It is characterized by a rapid information exchange. This involves the rapid integration of technology in our lives through smart devices. The key technologies of the 4IR, as it is known in short, are artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, big data, cobots in an additive manufacturing environment, 5G connectivity, and blockchain technologies. The first industrial revolution, which started in 1760 with the invention of steam engine, transformed our lives and economy from an agrarian and handcraft economy to one dominated by industry and machine. Oil and electricity facilitated mass production in the second industrial revolution with the invention of the internal combustion in 1900. The third industrial revolution started in 1960 and was characterized with the implementation of electronics and information technology to automate production. Although each industrial revolution is often considered a separate event, together they can be better understood as a series of events building upon innovations of the previous revolution and leading to advanced forms of production and new insights in research and knowledge production. Remarking on the advent of 4IR towards the end of the last decade, Klaus Schwab noted that we stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. In its scale, scope, and complexity, the transformation will be unlike anything humankind has experienced before. We do not yet know just how it will unfold, but one thing is clear: the response to it must be integrated and comprehensive, involving all stakeholders of the global polity, from the public and private sectors to academic and civil society. End of quote. These remarks highlight some of the challenges surrounding the fourth industrial revolution. The enormity of the challenges and the breadth required of the response are clear in terms of their disruptiveness. While there are many benefits of the fourth industrial revolution, there are several key challenges that lie ahead. One of the feared effects of the revolution is expanding greater inequality that already characterize our societies. 4IR is more than just technology-driven change. Rather, it is powered with disruptive innovation to possibly impact our core industries and sectors, such as education, health, and business. In education, with the previous industrial revolution, the focus on education changed. With the first IR, education was focused on standard modes of learning, such as standards of morality and society. This was followed by a move towards mass production in the second IR on standard testing. Education is service-oriented, and the third IR moved us to see students under a customer model. And now, in the fourth IR, technologies really blur the lines between physical, digital, and biological spheres. Disruptive innovation makes its way into higher education, in which it redefines conventional ways of university delivery. New modes of curriculum and teaching arise. The focus changes from modes of teaching to modes of learning. Alternative curriculums are being constantly developed. Disruptive innovation also reshapes how business operates. Thinking has really moved outside of the box. New markets are created and new products are defined. The 4IR context is a challenging one for developing African languages, which have been characterized as under-resourced. The paucity of resources is in respect of the grammars, as I have said earlier, particularly the descriptive grammars of these languages, the compilation of both large and specialized corpora as important data sets that are necessary for developing human language technologies, and the development of machine-readable lexicons present a challenge in this context. All these are important precursors for the development of the so-called HLTs. The fact that most of these languages subsist outside of the digital infrastructure is a huge threat to their continued use in future technologies. Program director and colleagues, I want to move to discuss an advancing scholarship within the humanities and social sciences, a scholarship that is spurred by some of the affordances of the 4IR, the Scholarship of Digital Humanities, DH for short. The Scholarship of DH promotes and advances digital research and teaching across arts and humanities disciplines using cutting-edge technological resources, providing scholars with new ways of looking at old problems while simultaneously advancing new knowledge and novel pedagogies. Digital humanities provides a bridge between the traditional practices of research and technology-driven research to scholars that are struggling quintessential humanist approaches and modern digital methodologies, tools and frameworks to support them in their novel avenues of inquiry. It is a growing scholarship in the humanities and social sciences that is spurred by advances in computing and digital spheres and providing new collaboration with engineering and computer and the so-called technosciences. As DH continues to grow, its landscape has become more inclusive. This is evinced through its vast reach across disciplinary and geographical boundaries. At the heart of this DH discourse are themes of connectivity, access, infrastructure, cultural sensitivity and inclusion, principles that are necessary to achieve the collaboration so essential to DH. The contribution of DH programs to the global knowledge economy has been noted, both in the humanities and beyond. Yet there remains some exigency to reflect on DH work from a global rather than Western perspective. I want to draw from a chapter that is coming out in the book, The Bloomsbury Handbook of the Digital Humanities, edited by James Sullivan, that I co-authored with a colleague from the University of Toronto, titled Digital Humanities Outlooks Beyond the West. We posit the questions: does the purpose of DH programs, and by extension, the 4IR imperatives, as observed in the West, align with what the field achieves and seeks to achieve at the peripheries? What is the implication of studying and practicing DH for communities outside the West? Beyond the epistemological and the pedagogical, what is common or different in the conceptualization and operationalization of DH across spaces? And furthermore, why do these differences exist? These are some of the questions that seek to explicate how DH engages with cultures and societies beyond the West and proffer some explanations for some identified deviations. A fundamental question from a global perspective is DH intrinsically inclusive? There are several factors that have made DH what it is today. One is the impact of globalization. That is, as defined by Tefera Damchu, a flow of people, culture, ideas, values, knowledge, technology, and economy across borders, resulting in a more interconnected and interdependent world. Globalization has enabled the spread of DH beyond Europe and North America. It is in this sense that DH is viewed as borderless, both in terms of disciplinary boundaries and geographical, also continental borders. Another is the deliberate effort by the DH community to build an inclusive field, one that is particularly focused on bridging the gap between the center and the peripheries, and that is representative of diverse cultures and languages. It is unclear, however, how these originating forces have impacted DH's inclusiveness at the country level and at the individual communities level. The impact and adoption of DH beyond the West is complex because the field strives from global presence at a time when there is great scrutiny for appearances of neocolonialism in former Western-dominated territories. Many of the communities occupying the peripheries are still emerging from a history of colonial subjugation and apartheid. It is a history that saw the subjugation and supplanting of existing knowledge systems and ways of knowing, itself a form of epistemic violence that still exists in most education systems across Africa and Asia. Education is an engine of development, and how it is pursued is critical to the success of DH in developing states. Recently, there has been a drive towards inclusion and diversity within DH. Conference themes, presentations, and scholarly publications have included titles like Towards an Open Digital Humanities, Digital Humanities from a Global Perspective, Decolonizing Digital Humanities, Gender and Digital Humanities, Minority Report, The Myth of Equality in Digital Humanities, Towards a Queer Digital Humanities, and so on and so forth. These topics point to a shift in the subject matter from one that centers primarily around pedagogical approaches, theory, practice, and tools, to a consciousness that reflects social trends, advances, and changes within the field. Thus, inclusion and diversity have been two of the major drivers of discourse at DH conferences and events. But for DH to really function as a big tent, we need to appreciate what inclusion means and requires at the peripheries. Now I want to shift towards what I call digital humanities and the language conundrum. As argued by some, with this end of the Second World War, language imperialism became a new tactical method for global domination. Tragically, because Africa's colonial past, which saw the subjugation of her peoples and the proscription of African languages and African knowledge systems and ways of knowing from the Western school system, the curriculum in most African countries is still packaged and parceled out in English and in some instances, French. This effectively limits African learners, both in terms of the language of learning and teaching and the concepts that are explained in the foreign language. Learning in such schools, if any, is thereby reduced to rote memorization. Since, as discussed above, the spread of English is a form of post or neo-colonial movement, the continued swift global expansion of DH beyond the West, particularly into parts of Africa and Asia, has therefore initiated discussions about language and ways of knowing, which hitherto have been suppressed. English hegemony, the colorful history of the British colonial empire, and the modern day British-American global domination invoke critical perspectives in the context of DH expansion into its impact in the Southern Hemisphere. For instance, African languages present with remarkably interesting linguistic structures, as a result posing very interesting challenges to computational solutions in the global ontology. African epistemologies and worldviews that were previously exempt from the global knowledge economy provide new knowledge that challenges and also simultaneously enriches our collective understanding. Given the condescending perception of African indigenous knowledge systems by the West, the question arises as to whether these African IKS are viewed as new centers of knowledge from the peripheries or mere sites with potential to enrich the center. DH approaches have the capacity to challenge the norms of knowledge generation, sharing, and access. Program Director, it is important for DH scholars, therefore, to acknowledge this power relationship and the fact that although English has attained a global status, it does not possess the ability to provide a complete representation of native cultures in Southern Hemispheric communities, despite being the national and sometimes the official language in some countries. Taking such inadequacies of English into consideration would necessitate an embrace of diverse languages and the acceptance of accents at the peripheries, thereby enriching the base from which knowledge is created. When it comes to amplifying otherwise silenced voices in global DH, some fundamental questions to ask are, what counts as knowledge? Is there a single ontology? Is there a single way of knowing? Whose knowledge dominates the current global knowledge economies? For example, the decolonization of curriculum in the South African higher education sphere is viewed in the context of the current dominant Eurocentric theories, thinkers, and ideas at the expense of African worldview, centeredness, and relevance. It is argued that societal relevance is a crucial factor for the education to be meaningful. Spivak, in 2017, has argued about the notion of epistemic violence, a form of silencing that has left those existing on the fringe cognitively damaged. This notion of epistemic violence expresses the Eurocentric and Western domination and the subjugation of former colonial subjects through knowledge systems. The curriculum, packaged in European languages and expressing European worldviews, were designed to degrade, exploit, and subjugate Western colonies. The learning is reduced to memorization that is devoid of critical thinking and cognitive development, which has resulted in what Spivak calls cognitive damage. The tragedy is that these Eurocentric worldviews persist today in South African and African higher education systems. And DH may have been unwittingly ensnared by the legacy of the colonial infrastructure. In order to exploit the full content and context of decolonization of DH in academia within the peripheries, there are a few things that can be done to amplify silenced voices. These include deepened understanding, encouragement of diversity, and provision of training and technical support. The center may explore how to understand and contextualize global differences. Digital projects that exhibit Afrocentric, Oriental, or South Asian reflections should be encouraged, acknowledged, and the linguistic diversity affirmed, especially that of nuance at the periphery and its influence on the presentation of ideas. Perhaps then we can begin to experience what Beric and others describe when they say the decolonization of knowledge is in the profound sense, will arrive only when we enable people to express their one otherness, their difference, and their selves through truly social and participatory forms of cultural creation, and indeed of knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination, innovation, and exchange. DH platforms must not be exclusionary. They must not be prescriptive. They must be accommodative in embracing the peripheries and their complexities. In this way, the center is disrupted in a positive way in order to embrace the new insights and complexities of the peripheries. The infrastructure in the global south adds to the rich diversity of the DH field. South Africa, for instance, has recently established the South African Center for Digital Language Resources, SADILA for short. SADILA is one of the 13 national research infrastructures established in the South African Research Infrastructure Roadmap that are funded by the Department of Science and Innovation. The South African Research Infrastructure Roadmap is intended to provide a strategic, rational, medium to long-term framework for planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the provision of research infrastructures necessary for a competitive and sustainable national system of innovation. SADILA has a strategic function to stimulate and support research and development in the domains of human language technologies, natural language processing, language-related studies, and digital humanities in the humanities and social sciences. It is thus far the first and only such infrastructure in the African continent. As its flagship program, SADILA has initiated the Escalator Project, whose thrust is to provide an inclusive and active community of practice in digital humanities and computational social sciences in South Africa. Through the Escalator Project, SADILA has introduced a Digital Humanities Ignite, DH Ignite for short, event series that will see the development of an active community in DH and computational solutions across the country through training and engagement programs across all the 26 public education institutions. To conclude, Program Director, the vision and the legacy of the luminaries of our past, such as the John Langalibalele Dube, is not for us to only celebrate, but to draw inspiration and enduring lessons from. It is instructive that J.L. Dube saw education as an important part of our human progress. It is equally instructive that J.L. Dube saw the importance of using mother tongue in discussing all the complexities of our life, including finding solutions to those complexities. The legacies that have prepared us well in confronting the complexities of 4IR. I hope that I have shown how his vision endures up to today, for education remains the most transformative tool for social progress and future innovations. It is through his work that we have been enabled in developing corpora that are necessary for developing necessary technologies that are part of the infrastructure of the 4IR. I hope that I have shown that decolonization is a call for plurality in sources of knowledge and not the current negation of the other worldviews as espoused by some Western epistemologies. By embracing rather than rejecting other ways of knowing, a unified DH may realize a noble purpose of enriching and harmonizing knowledge and learning and supporting equity in development. This is an imperative that John Langalibalele Dube stood for. I thank you.
Right. I was actually trying to share my slide, but then, you know, after load shedding, this computer has frozen. In any event, thank you so much, colleagues, for inviting me to be part of this great occasion. And I'm glad that I'm part of you who are honoring, you know, these great men, Dr. J.L. Dube. I pass greetings from Nelson Mandela University, in particular from my dean, Dr. Mukim Mweng. And I also like to acknowledge that some of the thoughts and the perspectives that I'm going to share with you today are actually based on a project that the dean and I are involved in, which looks at language as a social justice issue in post-colonial higher education institutions, right? You know, in 2021, I presented at a Higher Education Disabilities South African Symposium. And the theme of the symposium was, what is there that we do not see? As much as my presentation was focusing on students with invisible disabilities in higher education institutions, I realized that the same question can be asked when it comes to issues of language and language policy implementation in higher education institutions. As much as there are legislative frameworks and ministerial reports that embrace the development of African languages as academic languages in higher education institutions, to me, it seems like we are taking long to see what is there. And what is there? It is the value of knowledge embedded in African languages, the richness of a multilingual academic space, and the value of languages as an expression of identity, culture, and heritage of its speakers. And success, in my view, just like Ongezwa alluded to in the poem, is the moment you see yourself, that is your language, your culture, and your identity in the academic space or environment where you are at. So what is already known about our institutions and what is currently happening there? You find that generally what we already know is that there is an increasing rise of enrollment numbers and access to higher education, you know, of students from African communities. And there's also recognition of transition challenges from secondary school to university. As a result, you find that most universities have put in place transition support strategies. And then what happens is when students are enrolled in their different courses, there are academic challenges. Hence, there are attempts, you know, in most universities to develop terminology lists that are not only in English, but also in African languages as well, and the translation of learning materials and bilingual tutorials and so forth. At the same time, we do note that there is a high dropout rate and low participation rate, especially amongst African students. This is always evident in the graduation throughput rates. And amidst all of that are funding and accommodation issues. But for me, all of these issues boil down to one question: who is the student in South African public higher education institution? Because I believe that before we even discuss the question of language, we really need to understand who is the student in our institutions. Because if you look at what we have and the dynamics, you know, of the students, you will find that students bring in higher education spaces a complex set of personal language and academic learning skills, as well as cultural embedded notions of what academic environment looks like. At the same time, you notice that they differ, as some of them, you know, they already have social and cultural histories, including friends and family members who have previously engaged with higher education themselves, and through which a shared set of social and cultural resources have been developed. But you do have those who don't have that. They are first time, you know, students at varsity. And at the same time, I think we are all aware somehow that one of the greatest challenges at university is academic writing, because writing in university is a specialized form of writing which is connected to various disciplines and professions. It is a complex activity which does not come naturally to some second language speakers or second language students, as they have to deal with the writing skills and the writing culture of the institution. So those are some of the things that we are actually facing at the moment. So if we agree in this lecture that South Africa is a linguistical and cultural diverse society, and that higher education reflects this diversity, surely language does play a significant role in students' access, support, and success in higher education institutions. You might be aware that currently all universities are busy revising their language policies, because it was clear from the 2002 language policy framework of the country that there has been very slow change, if there has been. But I hear that at UKZN, there have been a lot of initiatives that have taken place, which is very much applauded. But in most institutions, this have been a very slow process, in actually implementing, and not just implementing, but even thinking about the process of changing, the language policy so that it caters for all students, in such universities. And what I like about this new language policy framework is the fact that it says it is now imperative to develop African languages as academic languages in higher education institutions. And interestingly, if we look at the major or the key imperatives, that is the development of African languages and the promotion of multilingualism, even the framework itself does acknowledge that there are still challenges in our institutions in as far as these are concerned. So the question then that I wanted to pose in this lecture is, how can we as institutions of higher learning establish a multilingual teaching, learning, and research environment which considers indigenous African languages as enablers to student access, success, and support? I do acknowledge that, yes, a lot of work has been done. There has been, pockets of research that has been done in major universities and in some of the universities. And also at the same time, there is evidence of the application of some strategies, multilingual strategies in the teaching and learning practices. And at the same time, if you look at the research that has been done in South Africa and in Africa in generally, it is notable that there have been theoretical and conceptual shifts in language and literacy research. And also a critique of conventional understandings of language are also gathering momentum with the emergence of theories and concepts that are being researched now, such as translanguaging and so forth. But at the same time, it is important for us to actually pose the question within a theoretical and a historical context, because I believe that if we want to move forward, there are questions that need to be confronted, those uncomfortable questions, and those instances where you find that the debates on African languages are being silenced. I think that is what needs to be confronted as we move towards the realization of a new language policy framework and how it can be responsive to students' access, success and support in the institution. I mean, history does tell us that in South Africa, language has played a key role in ethnic and racial profiling of universities, which led to the evolution of institutional identities that we cannot ignore, because it is a reality that we are facing in our higher education institutions. And therefore, it can be posited that the question of language cannot be understood in isolation from the political history of the universities. And if you look at the work that has been done by Sihole 2007, he does present, a comprehensive overview of how the universities in South Africa have evolved. And when you examine the current language practices of such universities, you can see that, they have evolved from only having English or Afrikaans only as the recognized language, but also there is recognition of other languages. For instance, quite recently, it was announced that UCT will recognize Khoisan language in their language policy. And although these shifts are applauded, it's still not clear whether or not African languages are used as languages of scholarship in these universities. Colleagues, it is not a secret that in South Africa, English and Afrikaans are the two languages that have always enjoyed the status and privilege as both the medium of instruction and the official language in all educational and government institutions. This privilege legitimized these languages and gave them dominance and power as they are used to develop and implement educational policies. As a result, indigenous African languages were suppressed and regarded as, I quote, defective, primitive, and less intelligent, Reagan 2016. In effect, this Eurocentric linguistic ideology marginalized indigenous African languages and restricted indigenous people from accessing knowledge and contributing to knowledge creation. Moreover, after so many years of delegitimation of African languages, the excuse for not developing them is because of what we normally read about. That is, there is this notion of linguistic inadequacies, and that view has been critiqued in literature as languages are recognized to differ in terms of structure, lexicon, orthography, and so on. And then there's another issue that is always, brought forth when we discuss the issue of African languages in higher education institution, and that is the question of the market value of the English language. And now when you look at scholars like Kamakalu, who argue for a language policy that not only aims to promote African languages, but also demonstrates economic benefits in terms of students having good opportunities after graduation. Graduates who have studied in more than one language may well have advantages in a competitive job market. Who then will ensure African languages have market value, if not the institutions where knowledge is produced? And what is our role? We need to ask ourselves as institutions of higher learning, what is our role, or what is the role of knowledge production in influencing policy and change? And that also brings me to the whole question of graduate attributes. Because if we are discussing and debating the issue of a language and market value of that particular language, what are the graduate attributes in our institutions? Do we then consider, that African languages, in other words, none of the students should graduate unless they demonstrate competence, in an African language, whether it's on a conversational level or any other level. So I think we also need to take that into consideration. So therefore, suggesting ways in which African languages can be positioned as languages of scholarship should consider not only the historical and theoretical context, but the dynamics and complexities of language policy implementation. Language policies are mostly guided by ideologies, which in turn inform practices. Such practices could either empower or disempower individuals. We may recall that some years back, higher education in South Africa has been a site of student protest. And at the core of those protests were language politics, which drew attention to theories of decoloniality and which challenged universities to examine their language policies and practices. And a call for attention to languages began as far as Ngokiwa Tiongo. I think colleagues have, constantly mentioned his role in this debate. The major concern was basically about cultural genocide that is committed by the massive replacement of African languages with colonial languages in high domains of life. So other complexities have just been brought forth I remember last year in the Vice Chancellor's colloquium, because for instance, Professor Khumalo, I agree with him when he highlighted the fact that the lack of institutional commitment, the financial resources and digital infrastructure, the absence of implementation frameworks, and the dearth in human language expertise. Then those are some of the things that we need to take into consideration. I was happy, Prof. Khumalo, when you raised the question of, the epistemologies and the knowledge systems that are still existing in our South African universities. And the fact that I asked myself, if that is the case, that is really concerning, because almost all universities have introduced new policies and frameworks that speak about equality, equity, transformation, and change. And I think that's why Mbebe actually argues that, I quote, there is something profoundly wrong when syllabus is designed to meet the needs of colonialism and apartheid continue well into the liberation era. And obviously, we cannot talk about language and language policy implementation without tackling the issue of curriculum, because language is arguably key to curriculum development. And therefore, the question of which language, I think, Prof, you did allude to that in your presentation, is very important, because I argue that curriculum designers, should actually produce counter-curricular discourses that will reflect integrated knowledges, subject, of course, to crucial scrutiny. So now, in order to establish a multilingual teaching, learning, and research environment, which considers Indigenous African languages as enablers to student access and support, I think I want to propose the following. Higher education institutions need to acknowledge that African languages have a pedagogical value in the scholarship of teaching, research, innovation, and engagement. For instance, when African languages are not included as languages of teaching and learning, are students not conditioned to believe that their success in a globalized and capitalist world depends solely on the mastery of English, and raises questions about access to opportunities and employability after graduation? The question is, how are these concerns addressed in our institutions? However, this pedagogical issue can only be addressed when it is recognized as a political issue, as indeed all social justice issues are. Language practices in universities should not deny people access to knowledge and resources because of their diverse languages. For example, most of the learning materials available in institutions of higher education are presented in English and Afrikaans. Available resources in African languages are mostly translated from English. This is problematic, as it assumes that learning resources cannot be usefully written firsthand in African languages. In our view, because I wrote this with my dean, as I said earlier, equity will be achieved when knowledge is accessible and resources are available in all languages. And at the same time, as we are in this process of reviewing the language policies in higher education institutions, I think it is very significant. And one of the functions of higher education institutions is to prepare students to engage in public life. It makes sense that students should be prepared to disseminate knowledge in the languages that the wider community understand well. Revised language policies will take this into consideration and thus address an imbalance in the nature and structure of our universities. Mayaba 2018 asserts that this requires a bottom-up approach, which begins when members of the community identify and are able to speak courageously about their language experiences, which they feel have been marginalized at the university. Change cannot be imposed. It requires buy-in from all concerned, just as the Nelson Mandela Foundation's vision is that a society that understands its past, listens to all its voices, and pursues social justice. When that past is interrogated and understood, the university will be able to move towards an inclusive language policy. And also when it comes to curriculum design, because in the institution of higher learning, we can talk about everything else, but if you don't tackle the issue of curriculum design, then we are missing the point. I think these issues are very important. First, indifferent attitudes that often persist even before addressing the critical questions on knowledges must be confronted. When debaters and curriculum designers are unable or unwilling to think beyond the unquestioned assumption that only Western Eurocentric knowledge is valid and valued, that silences the debate on the validity and importance of another knowledge or other knowledges. Secondly, during epistemological debates on African position, an African position needs to be clarified to address the remnants of discomfort and uncertainty associated with moves to include indigenous ways of knowing in the curriculum. Debaters must be mindful that indigenous African ways of knowing are not measured against Western ways of knowing, because on their own, they are sustainable and relevant to society. They are rooted in African people's cultures, languages, values, spiritual lives, and ecological practices. And maybe because I'm from the Faculty of Education, it's important that I also address the teacher education preparation programs, because I feel they should take into consideration the philosophies that underpin their curriculum. It's common knowledge that African philosophy is barely used to raise consciousness about issues of identity, culture, thought, and civilizations. It is questionable whether teaching and learning approaches used in teacher education make it explicit that skills and values such as respect and work ethic are bolstered by African philosophy. Studies such as the one conducted by Mudali, I think Mudali is from UKZN, should be encouraged and shared with students. In his study, pre-service teachers planted a vegetable garden using indigenous methods and cultivated indigenous and non-indigenous plants. The author mentions that through the process of this study, consciousness raising about the value of indigenous learning system occurred. So to end on a positive note, we are engaged in the work of the community of practice for the teaching and learning of African languages. When we were introduced, Prof. Langa Khumalo is the chair of the forum, and I am the vice chair of this forum. It was established in 2016 and involves all South African universities. And the main objective of this forum is to strengthen and promote the teaching of African languages in public universities in South Africa. And COPAL is convened 3 times a year to have discussions and share ideas on the revision of language policies. And member universities are tasked with providing an explicit update in COPAL meetings. So far, most universities are working on their revised policies and implementation plans, which is an encouraging sign for the future. And as COPAL, we have also partnered with the University of Stellenbosch in September 2021 to host a Vice Chancellor's Colloquium on language policy implementation, because we felt that if we don't get leadership, and a buy-in from the Vice Chancellors, it will be impossible for us to be arguing these debates on how the language policy can be responsive to students' access, support, and success. And this year, the same forum will be held in the University of Pretoria on the 1st to the 2nd of December, 2022. I thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, colleagues. Wow. Thank you very much for those presentations. You've really educated us. Now is the time for Kumbulani Mngadi to come in and to give his response. But before that, is just to remind you, colleagues, that you can post your questions there at the chat room. It's open for all of us to post the questions. And now we give over to Madlogovu. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Kabazela, Program Director, Professor Khumalo. Please allow me to say all protocol observed in the interest of time, but I would like to acknowledge the Dube family and the presenters, Prof. Khumalo, Prof. Zanga, as well as Dr. Mkhize. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you all. Program Director, it will be amiss of me if I don't report to Mafuguzela that today I'm responding from Spain at the University of Salamanca, hosted by Professor Arab Masquera. And I am with my fellow South African scholars from UWC, Northwest University and Rhodes University. We are continuing the journey that was started by Mafuguzela in 1887 when he visited US for the first time. Today, I'm tasked to respond on a number of issues that the presenters have put forward, but I'm thankful that the solutions have been ventilated with the rigor it has been longing for. Today, today's lecture is about the indigenous languages and decoloniality in higher education. As you know, Mafuguzela was passionate about these topics as he was among the men of letters that pioneered isiZulu literature. The University of KwaZulu-Natal, it's known for its bold and pioneering spirit in the field of language. It prides itself for being the university, a premier university of African scholarship. The executive support is unparalleled. We are working with academic disciplines, with all colleges, plus professional services. And students are embracing the project of intellectualizing African languages, and they are participating in decoloniality debate. South Africa is praised worldwide for its constitution and its admirable ideas, from which we have developed our excellent policies and legislations. However, it has been glaringly lacking in practical and tangible output from all concerns. As early as in the 1800s, J.L. Dube had this vision of developing African languages as he founded Ilanga KwaZulu-Natal. Perhaps what we need to ask ourselves is a critical question of how much do we need to do in this particular fourth IR industrial revolution so that we can leave a long-lasting legacy as today's generation. If Dube and his peers started this journey this long, we should be in a position to say, this is how we have contributed in developing these African languages. In order to answer this question objectively, perhaps, we need to confront and acknowledge the following. One, I think Prof. Khumalo and Prof. Mzanga have highlighted this. English hegemony is the elephant in the room. We need to start working as a collective, as South African universities. We need to avoid poor planning and poor coordination. We need to allocate resources where they are supposed to be allocated. Perhaps we need to confront this political expediency over our heritage, over our future. We need to be in a position to say to the powers that be, enough is enough. We need to collectively accelerate the development of these African languages through interdisciplinary research, technological advancement, and community engagement. Let's look at let's not look at the language in isolation, rather, let us look at it as a catalyst for decoloniality debate. In Dr. Mkiza's talk, she says, decolonizing our universities is about raising the status of African languages, and African intellectual contribution to the same parity of esteem as that of English in order to reflect the multilingual society that South Africa is. Program Director, this is precisely what is currently happening. I've skipped my slides. Apologies, Program Director. Program Director, this is precisely what is currently happening as we are here in Spain with our Bakonde partners. We are here to share expertise and learn best practices on how to teach multilingually. We are here to share experiences on how to develop innovative multilingual teaching methodologies. Program Director, John Langalibalele Dube would be happy to hear that today we have a vibrant community of practice called Corpus. Prof. Mzanga and Prof. Khumalo have highlighted the structure or the relevance of the structure. This body is there primarily to focus on improving ways and means of achieving this feat as a collective. Much of our failures in the past are emanating from a disorganized community of practice. Prof. Mzanga spoke about the currency of our African languages as another elephant in the room. As language directories from across 26 universities, we are working around the clock to forge partnerships so that we can tackle this language development agenda in one voice. We have realized that the power of working together, and we have identified synergies and individual focus areas so that we can tackle this developmental agenda of our languages. The higher education need to value indigenous languages as sources of knowledge and capable of informing learning of different disciplines in higher education. That cannot be overemphasized. The value of collaborative partnerships to promote multilingualism is very important. The commitment to the promotion of language equity, equality, and fairness should be at the forefront of what we are doing. The commitment to the development and promotion of indigenous languages to redress the past injustices should be our paramount objective. What we are trying to do is to nurture the environment where multilingualism is not seen as a problem, but is seen as a resource to facilitate cognitive and epistemic access, inclusiveness, transformation, and social cohesion in respect of all languages, and to promote human dignity, and as a stance against the use of any language for the purposes of exploitation, exclusion, domination, discrimination, and the creation of respective institutional culture at universities. Program Director, those are the values that are espoused by this community of practice called COPAL. Program Director, perhaps to chart the way forward, after having listened to all the speakers, one of the most important things to do is the acceleration of technological advancement. Prof. Khumalo talked about the importance of developing these data sets in our African languages. It is so important that we focus primarily on developing these languages in line with the expectations that are coming with the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The second one is working as partners like we are doing today. Partnerships are very important. The third one is interdisciplinary research. It is important that when language practitioners are trained, they are trained with an understanding that they are going to be doing work that need interdisciplinary research, that need multidisciplinary research. Coordination of national and international institutional and inter-institutional projects is very important. The language awareness campaigns are very important in this particular drive. Universities must identify their own niches insofar as terminology is concerned, so far as literature is concerned, so far as human language technologies are concerned. These are going to be very key in establishing and forging these partnerships that I was talking about. We must be in a position to modernize curriculum, Program Director, in the language practice and in other fields, so that if we are to develop these particular languages, we need to see value in working with other disciplines so that the currency of the language or of our languages, as we were talking, should be seen as our priority. And we need to engage communities from which these universities are based so that we do not leave them outside of what we are trying to do. Below is what University of KwaZulu-Natal has been able to do. We have been able to develop the Temp Bank. We have been able to develop the National Corpus. We have been able to develop the spell checker. We have been able to develop the mobile app. Because of the time, I would like to end here, but I will share with you all what I had prepared for this particular response. But more than that, thank you very much, Program Director, and thank you very much to everyone for listening. Thank you.
Dlogovu, siyabonga. Thank you very much, Dlogovu. Friends, just an apology from Mr. Langa. He's experiencing load shedding. And so from now on, we'll just go straight to Usis Poliswa, who is going to be leading the question and answer session briefly. And then she will hand over to Professor Nobuhle Hlongwa, who's gonna do the vote of thanks for everyone. I'm not going to appear again here. I'm done, but thank you very much. Over to you, Sis Poliswa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Khumalo. I hope everyone can hear me. Our audience is very quiet. We just have one question at the moment. But audience, please feel free to ask your questions live or put them in the Q&A or the chat. But our panelists are very, very happy to respond to your questions. I think this question will be for our panelists, all three of them. The question is from Mongezi Bulofo. How do we get to a point where African languages are also languages of entry to higher education? A prospective student can be 1% less required mark of English and possesses a distinction in mother language, in mother tongue, but still be considered less linguistically suitable for university? So this question is for our three panelists. Can I start with you, Dr. Kize?
Thank you, Xoliso. I think that's a very, very important point that Mungezi raises. And I think it should also go back to even the prospectus. Sorry, I'm back. I think it even goes back to the prospectus. I think the prospectus for access as well, should be in isiZulu so students can read. I remember when I joined UKZN, I had a prospective student from my community who didn't understand a particular question in the application form. And she actually, for 3 years, so she was deserving, she had all the points to get into UKZN, but for 3 years, she kept on being rejected. And when I looked at the form, she didn't understand one simple question in English. And if the prospectus were in Zulu, someone could have assisted her, who understood. So I think that's a very, very good question. And I think, especially if you're looking at a bilingual language policy, and students should be taught in isiZulu and English, and they could have that choice. So if someone, passes this distinction in their mother tongue, so they can access the knowledge, but the knowledge is in English, So it's not because they're not clever enough or anything, it's just that the university is not prepared already to accept such students. So I think that's a very, very important point and something that we can consider going forward in terms of access and looking at that point system and the marks if they're excelling in isiZulu. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Mkhize. Can I move over to you, Professor Khumalo?
Thank you, Sis Xoliso. I think the other aspect of that question is a policy shift, a policy that affirms African languages and provides that status, the status of them being a prerequisite for entry to university. And I think that is something that the community of practice can take up, the community of practice for the teaching and learning of African languages. And this community of practice, I must emphasize, is the substructure of USAF, University of South Africa. So that's how the important the community of practice is. And if they were to create a process that may lead up to that type of policy shift, currently the policy does not, it doesn't say anything about that, but it would require indeed a policy shift for the requirement that African languages are part of the entry requirement for taking up a degree program at the university. But it's an important and symbolic proposition, and I think it would go a long way in affirming the centrality of African languages in the academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Khumalo. And lastly, Prof. Dzanga.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this question. I do agree with both of my colleagues. Like Dr. Mkhize said, this is a question of access, and Prof. Khumalo said this is a question of policy shift. I also want to add and say, part of what we do in the revision of our language policies in our institutions, it's basically to look at the institution itself. In fact, the process of multilingualism as an institutional issue, and not only a question of the curriculum or teaching and learning. So what it means when it comes to admission policies, there should be change, and that change will address the question that has been raised. For instance, if our admission policies then can take into consideration that an African language is a language on its own and it can stand on its own, then that would be one thing. And the second thing, which I think is also debated at COPAL, is this collaboration and between Department of Basic Education and Department of Higher Education and Training. You find that currently DHET has changed the policy, like we have a new or revised language policy. And then with DBE, we're still operating with the language and education policy of 1997. And then there's a disconnect now between these two. So I think that debate and conversation between DBE and DHET is very crucial as well, in this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. You're right, that conversation is indeed quite crucial for those two departments. And thank you to the panel. I've just got one or two comments from Sarojini Govender, who says, I just want to say thank you for such a relevant topic and to make the vision of Dube become relevant. She then says, I'd like to contribute by saying it's high time that we act more than we speak in terms of decolonizing the languages of the colonizers. And before I move on to one of our panelists who's raised his hand, Mr. Mngadi, I'll just like to reiterate again that the audience can ask questions live, so you are free to raise your hands if you do have any questions. Over to you, Mr. Mngadi.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand over to my colleague here, Dr. From the University of Northwest. She would like to ask a question. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you so much. This goes to one of the panel members who can answer the question. I just want to find out, how do we make lasting relationships, lasting collaborative efforts, long-lasting ones between universities or institutions of higher learning in the development of African languages? So I just want to know, how can we make this collaborative efforts long-lasting with fruits that we can see, and make sure that the next generation can see and can benefit from such collaborative efforts? Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe we can give that question to all our panelists. Can we start with you, Prof. Zanga?
Okay, I'm a teacher, so I was like, okay, maybe it goes like Mkize, Kumalo, and then myself. So I was laughing when you called my name. In any case, you're talking about long-lasting collaboration. Yes, I think the work of COPAL, I will go back to COPAL, is actually trying to establish that, because we're talking of 26 universities that are encouraged to work together in terms of projects, in terms of terminology development and so forth. So I think that is one of the roles of COPAL, to ensure that we collaborate with one another and whatever we do can be shared, because that is the whole point of collaboration. And secondly, what is currently happening, we are tasked, for instance, by USAF to come up with a proposal. It's a funding proposal. And the process of coming up with that proposal, all universities contributed to it, so that when it goes to USAF, then it's one voice, and with people who have common interest and are very much interested in achieving, the goals of ensuring that the language policy is being implemented in our institutions. So I would say one of the efforts then will be more about collaboration and partnerships, not just in theory, but in terms of publications, in terms of core supervision, in terms of co-writing modules, and in terms of sharing our expertise, being exchange lecturers in our institutions. So the more we make it practical, the better. And I think it will have a long-lasting effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Can I move over to Professor Dr. Mkize, and then Professor Khumalo after that?
I actually think that Professor Mzanga answered that very well. But what I'll add is that also, instead of only looking at structures, yes, structures are there, they're good for collaboration and pulling resources together. But I think even at department level and lecturer level, like she's saying, to have a lecture exchange, you know, for a module that you're doing, to look at what is UCT, what is Rhodes doing in your discipline. What are their offerings? You know, what is, you look at their templates, what are they doing? And that's one way that you can collaborate as well. So not just looking at structures and depending on them, but using the power that you have yourself as an academic to collaborate with people in your department, to review the curriculum and say, you know, and to be open and say, this is what I know, this is my area of expertise, but I feel like I need someone to comment on my module, and to add something about, you know, to help, to assist in the decolonization of the curriculum, because we can't assume that all academics are for decolonization, right? And we need to understand that, and we also need to be there to assist each other. So instead of looking to structures, I would say also just start with the person next door in your office and the institution closest to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Prof. Khumalo, do you want to take that, or should I move on to the next question?
I think the question has been sufficiently addressed.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I've got two more questions. One is reads as follows: as long as the middle class, including the academic community, do not value African languages, what we are talking about will not see the light of day. How do we decolonize our own minds vis-a-vis African languages? And the second question is, thank you to all the panelists for incredibly interesting talks. Many great solutions have been proposed for the long term. Do the panelists have some advice for the immediate short term, how academics, also those who do not speak an indigenous language, can teach their students more effectively in the very present? I'll give that last question to Professor Khumalo, and the question before that to Professor Mzanga. Thank you.
Yes, how do we do that in the present? I think the thing is, teaching in African languages is not about the professoriate themselves, the lecturers themselves. It's about the students. It's about pedagogical epistemic access. The students are the ones that want to access the science, and you are using every affordance in the lecture room, in the classroom, for students to successfully engage with and access and break down the science. Because at the end of the day, you want them to be knowledgeable. And when they write the exam, they're writing it with the kind of confidence that somebody who has gone through the curriculum and understood it can show. So I think the students have the language. Even if the lecturer might not have the language, probably the lecturer is English, mother tongue, or monolingual, the student themselves can begin to use strategies that have been advanced in the theory of translanguaging to interact with the curriculum, to break down the curriculum, to navigate the complexities of the science. Because I think our examinations are not there to test comprehension or the eloquence in the English language, but to test the understanding of the science. And that is why the challenge of associating the use of African languages with dumbing down the curriculum does not hold water, because the science can never be made less complex. But you are using the languages to access the complexity that is intrinsic in the science. And students can, and even soon after the lecture room, I mean, the experiment that Professor Madiba at the University of Cape Town shared with the community of practice some 2 years ago, how students are navigating mathematics and science curriculum using the isiXhosa and other African languages is testament to the fact that students can actually do that. All you need to do as the professor standing in front of the classroom is to provide that space. Do not prescribe the use of any language in the classroom. Let the students navigate the curriculum using the languages that they bring in the classroom. You're doing two things. You are affirming those languages that they are bringing in the classroom in the first instance. And in the second instance, you are allowing students to begin to create the necessary terminology that they are using in understanding some of these complex concepts. And therein lies the process of intellectualizing language, intellectualizing these African languages. And down the line, people like Mngadi will pick up those terms and they will formalize them in the terminology development processes. And that's a formal structure, and they know that very well. But they would have started in the classroom when they break down the curriculum and understand, and in the process of understanding what is being taught in the science. So the lecturer does not, in the first instance, right now, need to know any of the African languages. You just need to afford the students the space in the classroom to actually break down the curriculum using the languages that they bring in the classroom. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Prof. Prof. Mtsanga, do you want to take on the second question?
Okay, thank you so much. Prof. Libo, the question that you're raising is very true. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate. And first of all, say, I don't blame them. I don't blame the academic community or the middle class because of what Mignolo said, that this whole thing, it's more of a colonial wound. You know, people are wounded because of their language experiences and how language has been used to suppress them. And also when they look at the opportunities that are out there and how those opportunities actually, you know, favor and privilege a certain, you know, the use of a certain language. But at the same time, I think now that we know the truth, you know, there's that moment where you actually get to know the truth and realize that you've been lied to all your life. So I think we need to come to that point where we educate ourselves, we educate, you know, people, the communities, because for me, this whole notion of multilingualism and indigenous African languages is a societal issue. It's not just an issue for the universities, it is a societal issue. I think one of the colleagues did mention earlier that we also need to, I think it was Mr. Kumbulani Mngadi, when you talk about engaging communities, you know, from which our universities are, because we don't exist in isolation from our communities. So if maybe we can look at this debate as a societal issue and educate our society, including us as academic community, as well as people, as the middle class, in terms of what this means. And I'm just thinking of an example. And, you know, I'm raising a child with autism. And because I'm a teacher, I always inquired, you know, on a number of issues that are happening in the classroom. And then when I have conversations with other parents, I would think to myself, am I asking a lot of questions because I know about the pedagogical realities of a classroom? So the same applies. I don't think parents, for instance, are aware of the pedagogical realities of what is happening in that grade R classroom and how these children are being taught to learn English and the strategies that are used, you know, and how demeaning and how, you know, competitive and all those values that are not African that are being imposed, the things that we see every day as we supervise students in these schools. And also, I think one of the debate that as an academic community we need to have, I saw in the UKZN you know, website, I think it was a reflection from last year's lecture that Dr. Dube talks about thinking of education as liberation and driver of economic opportunity. Maybe we should start, you know, adapting that code and think of African languages as liberation and as driver of economic opportunity. Because what I don't think we realize is the fact that if you look at these European countries that are so successful in their technology and so forth, what language are they using? Are they not using in China? Are they not using Chinese? And using their own home language and mother tongue, has that not brought them to the point where they are? And what about us? Can't we start? Because there's always a beginning. There's always a beginning. But as long as we can realize the truth, as to the fact that we've been lied to all of our lives. So I think so what I'm saying is more about educating ourselves about the realities, of language and what it means. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Goodness, your response actually just hit home for me, especially about educating our kids in their home languages from the foundation phase. I know exactly what you're talking about, because I went through the very same thing with my son, where I was told that he needs to learn English. He should not be bilingual, or he won't understand what his teacher is saying. Very, very difficult process to go through. Thank you for that, Prof. I've got a final question for Dr. Mkhize, and it's from Mongezi. A lot of resources being developed are still English-based. When are we going to see African languages to African language resources development? Over to you, Dr. Mkhize.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And it also links to the previous question from Prof. Moredzane about how do you decolonize our minds, where African languages are concerned. So the material that you see is written obviously in English, or resources that are there are in English. Because they're probably developed by people who speak English, by English speakers. And then secondly, people who speak African languages or indigenous languages needs to be involved in the process. And also you assign value to something where you see that there's value in it, right? So in terms of people seeing value in African languages, you see value, people even begin to see value in African languages and having those resources in African languages when you see African languages used in higher domains. So when you see that even the simple thing like the report, the transcript being written in isiZulu, or having English and isiZulu alongside, in the curriculum, in the exam questions, in the tests, in everywhere that you go at university, you should be able to see the language reflected there in the institutional culture and in the visual culture there as well, and the signage that is there as well. So I think the people who are working within those areas and with those resources, you show value through the language that is used, and you affirm that language through, that resource by the language that you use and who has access to it and who is it made for. Okay, who's the end user for that resource? So I think those are things that need to be kept in mind when people are compiling resources, putting things together. Who is the end user and who is the end user's language? Because at university, a lot of people, the majority at university, especially UKZN, are African students who speak indigenous languages, and our curriculum, our visual culture should reflect that as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mkhize. I've been hit by load shedding, at least it's at the end of the lecture. So I'm sitting in the dark at the moment. But thank you so much to the panelists for responding so eloquently to the questions asked by the audience. That was the last question from the attendees. I'd like to hand over now to Professor Nobuhle Hlongwa, who will give us the words of thanks and closure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Xaliswa, for facilitating well the Q&A. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I do want to now take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you, ranging from our program director, Prof. Khumalo, who is our acting dean for the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics. Thank you very, very much, Prof, for the excellent work. I also do want to thank our DVC and the head of Humanities College, Prof. Mkhize, who welcomed us and also foregrounded the importance of Indigenous languages and the role that JL Dube played, especially in foregrounding and also in preserving isiZulu language. So that was very, very important, Prof, like understanding that at that time, Dube was able to establish an institute, which is where universities are going now. Universities want to carry on in terms of the training through the works of the institute. Dube was able to do that at that time. So we are very, very happy to see his works that even today, it still finds its way in terms of our intellectualization of African languages in higher education. Thank you very much, Prof. Mkhize. To our Dean and Head of the School of Education, Prof. Msibi, thank you very, very much for providing the strategic direction in terms of where UKZN is, where the School of Education is, and what it has done to promote African languages as languages of teaching and learning, as languages of scholarship in higher education. Thank you so much, Prof, for your contribution, and also to both schools, for hosting this important chair within the School of Education, and also working together with the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics. Thank you so much, Prof. To our poet, to our young lecturer, to Ongezwa Mbele. Oh, Sisi, enkosi kakhulu. Angazi ngingaqala kuphi ukubonga. Listening to you, it's like music. So please continue to inspire us, and please continue to inspire greatness in the kind of work that you do. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ongezwa. Now to our chair, Prof. Mletsane. Prof, I remember in one of the JL Dube memorial lecture, I remember that they once invited Dr. Vivi O. Mkhize, who came and he gave the first Dube lecture entirely in isiZulu. So we really, really appreciate the work that your office is currently doing in reconnecting and in making sure that the ideals of JL Dube keep on going, and we see those in all these memorials that we do as a University of KwaZulu-Natal. So through the work of your office, thank you very much, Prof, for that excellent work that you have been doing. I think this is the 19th memorial lecture. So thank you so much for the excellent work. To Prof. Masondo, Prof, we go back a long way, and also working together with both schools. Thank you so much for your excellent work, and also in introducing our guest for today, and also in engaging with the work of the JL Dube lecture. Prof, we really thank you very much. Please do continue to do the excellent work and working together between the two schools. Thank you very much, Prof. Now to our presenters. I'm not going to go because we have had your presentations and also the Q&A. There has been a lively engagement in terms of your presentations from Dr. Mkhize to Prof. Khumalo and also Prof. Mzanga. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your contribution. Tulani, if I go back and think that Dube was the founder of the Zulu novel, he is the first novel in Silagashang and all the other writings. the Ilanga Natal, I don't know. So it's amazing the kind of work that you do now with all those early intellectuals, their contribution to knowledge production. So I'm very, very excited that like you continue that work, and it's actually going to assist as we continue to intellectualize African languages in higher education. Prof. Khumalo, you will be happy that like we are on course, we are at advanced stage in terms of introducing a new degree where the digital humanities will be part and parcel of the curriculum in that degree. So we thank you very much, Prof, for sharing and for your presentation. And Prof. Mzanga, thank you so much. The work of Corpus, that body is very, very crucial. And I do agree with you that like as universities, like we need to work together and ensure that like we create those spaces, those spaces as universities where different institutions come and share best practice in terms of how they will start use African languages as languages of teaching and learning, as languages of scholarship. So we just need to start now, Prof. We shouldn't wait for us to say like we want to develop terminologies before we start using the languages. The best way is for us to do this. One important example at UKZN that we have, and also going back to some of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, is that like you don't necessarily to be an isiZulu speaker or a Setswana speaker or Swahili speaker to be able to start using that African language as a language of teaching and learning. At UKZN, in our School of Arts, our lecturer, who is English speaking, allowed students to use isiZulu and allowed that in class. And that has led to us identifying his module. And we have now since translated his book into isiZulu. Now it's going to be used bilingually. Not only have we done that, but like we have gone to the extent of now taking the book back to be used by the students, and that has been checked. And now we are in the process of publishing this bilingual book. So such things do happen, but like it has to depend on the will of academics to be able to be part and parcel of bringing change in our university spaces. So thank you very much, colleagues, for all your presentations. Thank you so much. And to Madlogo, I think as you were doing your response, I'm not gonna go into everything that you have mentioned. And I was really, really impressed, especially with the way forward that we have presented to us. So we will work with that, with those 4 points. I'm not gonna go and repeat them, but like, thank you so much for the beautiful response that you have given. And to Ms. Xolisa Zulu, thank you so much for facilitating the Q&A. Thank you so much, colleagues. I just want to thank everyone, from members of council to members of Senate, to our deans who are here, to our fellow colleagues. I'm so excited that Mr. Ngadi is with our fellow colleagues in Madrid at the University of Salamanca. As part and parcel of the work of Bako and the colleagues, we value your presence and in attending this Dube lecture today, and the type of work that you do there in promoting the use of African languages in higher education, and also trying to create those multidisciplinary online resources is the work that like we want to see at the end of these partnerships that we're having nationally and also internationally. Colleagues, I do want to thank you very much. What I like with this Dube lecture, Prof. Moletsane, is that it's happening at the time when the UNESCO has declared a decade of African languages. Earlier this year, we were celebrating 15 years of UKZN's language policy. And it is so interesting that like right now, as we celebrate the work of J.L. Dube, we have a special focus on Indigenous languages. And most importantly, to the Dube family, I do want to indicate that the member of the Dube family couldn't be part and parcel of our program today. Send apologies. there was a problem of load shedding. But like we really want to thank the family for all the years of support they have given to the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Colleagues, I do want to thank the team, the PR team of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Melissa, Mponzo, Mkize, who am I leaving? Kate. So, but like the entire PR team from the College of Humanities and from the university at large, colleagues, some of you who are also are viewing in different social networks and also from other universities. We really, really appreciate your presence and participation in our proceedings for today as we celebrate the life of our literary giant, Umafuguzela Dube. Siyabonga kakhulu.
Bye-bye, colleagues.
Thank you, everyone. I just stopped the recording.
Thank you.
Thank you,
you so
everyone.
much. Thank
Fantastic
you.
lecture, guys. Well done.
Oh, that was excellent, colleagues. That was excellent.
Thank you, colleagues. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, colleagues, and thank you, team.
Thank
I have the A team, I must say.
You have an excellent team, Prof. Thank you so
Yes,
much
I
for all the organization. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Mel.
No problem, Prof. Hopefully next year we'll have an in-person one as usual.
Yeah, thank you, Ongs. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.